Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm joined here today by Liam O'Dwyer, as mentioned, from the Irish Red Cross, Dominic McSorley, CEO of Concern, and Caoimhe de Barra, the CEO of Trócaire. And we have Ross O'Sullivan and Matthew Morris both on the line, who will speak to the situation at the moment in the Ukraine from both Concern and the Red Cross perspective. Just to begin, I'd like to thank you, Chairman Flanagan, deputies and senators for the invitation to meet with you again so soon. Little did we realise just 6 weeks ago that the devastation and the horror that millions of Ukrainians would face today. Almost a month since the start of the conflict, over 3.5 million people have fled the country, the majority of whom are women and children. Millions more have fled their homes and are displaced in Ukraine, and as fighting continues, they will likely be displaced multiple times. That figure will only serve to increase in the coming weeks and months. Irish people have responded to this horrific conflict with immense generosity, solidarity and kindness. DOCA's members, including those here today, have seen this support in action with donations and offers of accommodation to those in need from thousands of supporters around the country. Before I hand over to our speakers joining us virtually, I'd like to share a snapshot of some of the key issues facing us with regards to the crisis in Ukraine. As the situation evolves, the humanitarian needs are becoming more and more critical, and reaching those in need is indeed becoming more difficult. We have seen this play out in Yemen, in Syria and in Afghanistan. Ordinary people, civilians, some trapped in besieged cities and towns, living in constant fear of indiscriminate attacks. Food, water, fuel, hygiene items and medical supplies are in desperate need. DOCAS is demanding that all parties to the conflict fulfil their legal obligations and uphold international humanitarian law. Civilians must be spared from military operations, and concrete agreements to allow safe passage for people fleeing the fighting need to be implemented and well communicated. All parties are obligated under international humanitarian law to ensure safe, unimpeded access to all areas to deliver aid and to reach vulnerable citizens who are trapped without services. Civilians, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure should never be a target. Over 6.5 million people are displaced within Ukraine. Up until recently, we've seen that people have been passing through collection centres located in central and western Ukraine, receiving support before heading towards border areas. However, more recently, we're seeing that this is changing somewhat. Cross-border movements are slowing, with numbers down to approximately 45,000 per day from originally 100,000 per day. Centres inside Ukraine are becoming more permanent in nature, requiring support and assistance. Very often it is the most vulnerable who do not have the means to move. They are fully dependent on available support and they are staying behind. This includes those who are elderly or those indeed who are living with disabilities. Supporting local organisations and civil society movements inside Ukraine is essential. They are often the first and the closest responders. Many of those who have fled the country in recent weeks have had the resources or connections to do so. And as this conflict evolves, those who flee the country to neighbouring countries will have less resources and very different and enhanced humanitarian needs. Major resources will need to be mobilised to assist EU member countries who are taking in those seeking safety. And finally, it's worth mentioning that the impact of this crisis goes far beyond Ukraine and will impact those already dependent on humanitarian assistance and those struggling in extreme poverty and hunger across the world. The conflict will have consequences on food security for many low-income, food import-dependent countries, particularly in Africa. 23 African countries are dependent upon Russia and the Ukraine for more than half their imports on one of their staple goods. The World Food Programme gets half its wheat it supplies and distributes to humanitarian crises from Ukraine. they will need to find other suppliers, and the costs of responding to other crises, such as Afghanistan, Syria and Yemen, will increase. Everything must be done to avert a catastrophic hunger crisis and the collapse of a global food system. I will now hand over to Matthew Morris of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and then to Ross O'Sullivan, who is leading Concern's humanitarian response in Ukraine. But first, we ask that you, as members of this community, support these vital asks. Firstly, for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine, this must be at the top priority. All sides to the conflict must protect civilians and civilian infrastructure under international humanitarian law, both for those who choose to leave and those who choose to remain. Safe passage for those willing and able to escape should be urgently assured across war-affected areas inside the Ukraine. This should not be dependent on the existence of humanitarian corridors or ceasefires that may be temporarily in place. It is vital that such opportunities for civilians to leave from areas of violent warfare are not once off or time limited. Ireland should use its seat on the UN Security Council to work with its international partners to ensure that any and all violations of international humanitarian law are investigated and immediately condemned, and the dignity and rights of civilians are protected. And lastly, we ask that Ireland step up and meet its pledge to fully fund all current humanitarian appeals and to avert essentially a catastrophic hunger crisis. I'll now hand over to Matthew, who's joining us from the International Red Cross. Matthew.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for asking us to participate in this session this afternoon. Across Ukraine, people are in a truly desperate, often horrifying situation. So many people are in danger, they're in hiding, or they're on the road, which means they're facing impossible choices. Do they stay or do they leave? My colleague just referred to some of the numbers, which are truly staggering. The UN estimating 10 million people on the move, 3.5 million of those outside the country. So these numbers are really quite staggering. Now, the level of need varies across the country. We were talking within the recent weeks to our colleagues who were in Mariupol in the southeast of the country, who described the situation there as apocalyptic, and our colleagues don't use words like that lightly. That was 2 weeks ago. So the situation has got much worse. And since then, they were telling us about having to use melted snow for water, going to streams to get water to drink, or even having to drain radiators for water. So that gives you, I think, some indication of how desperate the situation was, with constant shelling all around them. So we've seen significant numbers of people on the move, and significant levels of destruction. And what we're seeing with urban warfare is neighbourhoods turned into battle zones. And we know from our experience across the world in many other conflicts that when heavy weaponry like this is used in densely populated areas, the results can be catastrophic for civilians. Now, Ukraine is classified as an international armed conflict, so that means the Geneva Conventions and the first additional protocol apply. This is international humanitarian law, the laws of war, which aim to protect civilians and those not taking part in hostilities, and to govern the conduct of hostilities. It's also important to note that any attacks carried out with new technologies or any cyber means, they're also subject to international humanitarian law, which must be respected. Now, the Oireachtas has been in Ukraine for 8 years. We had, at the start of the conflict, we had around 600 staff, and we know that we've added to that by around 140 staff so far. And flexibility, adaptability is key to having to move the focus of our operations as events dictate. We're working closely with our Ukrainian Red Cross partners. They have something like 300 staff, 3,000 1,000 staff and volunteers, with 3,000 more volunteers signing up in recent weeks, and they're working at scale. And we're also working with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and our National Society Red Cross partners in the region, and of course the Irish Red Cross, and you'll hear from them shortly. So some moments of positive intervention that we've been able to do. For example, we've helped evacuate some civilians from the town of Sumi on 2 occasions. We've helped to distribute something like 200 tons of medical and relief supplies. Now, that's been sent around to locations in the country. It's not all gone to places in need, but we're working round the clock to do that in a number of places. I mentioned this as a couple of examples. These are drops in the ocean. These are not going to meet the staggering needs, and we as humanitarians need much more protected humanitarian space. We need that there is this talk of humanitarian corridors, and anything like that is welcome, but we need to be able to allow people to leave from areas where there is fighting, whether there is a corridor or not, and we need to be able to get aid in at all times, and that comes down to IHL. The ICRC, we're engaging with the parties to this conflict on a confidential and bilateral basis. That is what we do to remind them of their IHL obligations, and we're reminding them publicly and privately. The president of the ICRC was last week in Kyiv to meet with senior government officials there, and he will be in Moscow this week to hopefully do the same. So I'd just like to conclude with 3 brief points, if I may. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Irish government and the people of Ireland for the generous donations of €5 million towards our work in Ukraine, plus €1 million for the Federation, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. That will support our vital work. We'd like to encourage you to continue to promote the respect of international humanitarian law. The people caught up in this conflict must be supported and protected. And thirdly, when it comes to sanctions, we'd also encourage you to support our request from the EU for a humanitarian carve-out, some exemptions from sanctions, so that we can carry on unhindered our crucial work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that. I'll now hand over to Ross, who is joining us from Warsaw. Ross, would you like to go ahead?
Hello, good afternoon, Anca Horlock, deputies and esteemed guests, good afternoon. I'm actually in Krakow at the moment, not Warsaw, but not unlike the conflict, we're also moving around quite a bit, this being such a fast-moving situation and crisis. It is now a month since the crisis has escalated, and the ensuing conflict has set back the country of Ukraine economically, socially and infrastructurally by at least 20 years by UN estimates. The government of Ukraine are estimating that so far the most recent escalation of the conflict has caused over $100 billion in damages. As mentioned by earlier speakers, nearly 1/4 of the population of Ukraine is on the move, namely women and children. Upwards of 3.5 million have currently left the country and crossed over into neighbouring countries and beyond, to near countries and much further afield, including Ireland, and an estimated 6.5 million IDPs, people are on the move inside the country. IOM estimate by the end of this month alone, that number of people on the move inside Ukraine will have increased to over 8 million people. We are talking about twice the population of Ireland are on the move inside or outside Ukraine. That's how astronomical this conflict is. As mentioned earlier also, there's a distinct slowing down in the movement of people crossing borders from inside Ukraine right now. Roughly only 50% of those that were crossing the borders 2 weeks and 1 week ago are currently heading for the borders. It is strongly suggesting that the first wave of those who are trying to leave the country have already left. The majority of these people who have come out of Ukraine so far, they have some resources. They have connections either in that neighbouring country or in countries close by. But this will not be the same with any subsequent waves of people departing Ukraine. If there is a spike in numbers, if the conflict continues to escalate and drive people further west through the central west and into the far west, these people, if they do have to cross out of Ukraine, will have little or no resources to look after themselves. They'll have no travel documents whatsoever. They will likely never have been out of their region, let alone the country, before. They will be typically much older in profile, and they will not want to travel far from the border that they cross. This will bring significant hardship and stress on the receiving country's capacity to facilitate them, to house them, to feed them, and to take care of them. Especially in the neighbouring EU countries of Poland, Romania, Hungary and Slovakia, the EU will have to mobilise major resources to assist these member countries in coping with a very different type of Ukrainian, a person leaving the country with very, very different and enhanced needs. Moldova is a special case and will have to be supported as well by the EU. To date, all neighbouring countries receiving refugees have done so in an incredible spirit of camaraderie, solidarity, humanity, cooperation and kinship. But these people are working around the clock and supported by both state apparatus, civil defence, police, fire brigade, medical teams, etc., as well as civil society and a volunteer corps that is drawn from the public, local businesses, churches, schools and universities. This can only be maintained and sustained for a short while. As long as there are no major spikes in the numbers, which could easily overwhelm, which is a system that is currently held together by sheer goodwill and affinity. Inside Ukraine, people on the move are supported through local civil and administrative efforts at town and city level. There are quite literally hundreds of collective centres already established throughout central and western Ukraine, offering respite and assistance to people on the move travelling from east to west. These people have no family to go to. These collective centres are located in community halls, kindergarten schools, elementary schools, clinics, warehouses, and in many cases, they are not fully fit for purpose they are being used for. The collective centres can accommodate anything from 20 people up to 500. Host families are also housing people on the move, but for so far there is very little data known about how many people are being hosted. What is clear that up to recent weeks or so, IDPs have been passing through these collective centres en route to somewhere else, spending no more than a night or two, but this is now changing. Less Ukrainians are currently crossing borders or heading to border areas and are more inclined to stop and take refuge where they can in the hope that they don't have to go any further west, as they do want to return to the east as soon as practically possible. As such, these collective centres are taking on a less transient role and becoming less temporary and more permanent in nature. They require significant support and assistance in the short and medium term. Up to now, the collective centres are relying on the generosity of local businesses, volunteers and locally arranged self-help groups who are poorly resourced, poorly organised, poorly coordinated and are made up of volunteers in their entirety, so difficult to see how this can be sustained and maintained in its present guise. These self-help groups need training and support to form them into proper civil society groups that have more capacity, more reach, more scale, and most importantly, more training, especially around organisation, coordination, humanitarian principles and practice. Authorities, local, regional and national in Ukraine, require training and sensitisation around humanitarian principles and practice, especially with regard to the very, very real risks of diversion of humanitarian aid, as Ukraine is on a full war footing and under martial law. There is a very real need for increased and robust civil-military coordination in Ukraine, being led by and facilitated by the United Nations Humanitarian Agency, OCHA, its civil-military coordination function. NGO and lobby groups have warned that Ukrainian citizens fleeing the conflict in their country are at acute risk of exploitation by human traffickers, and this risk requires mitigation and protection measures at all host borders and in all host countries, and including the central registration and vetting of all civilian, volunteer, first-line responders. And lastly, for now, just to point out, the Ukraine crisis is very dynamic, uncertain and fast-moving. And humanitarian operations and funding need to be flexible and agile in order to be able to shift operations to different activities, sectors, and/or geographic areas within Ukraine, as well as into the EU and Moldova as needed. Thank you, An Cathaoirleach.
Thank you very much, Ross. Chairman.
Indeed, thank you. That was a pretty harrowing presentation, and we thank you for same. And undoubtedly, while matters are deteriorating on an ongoing basis, I think it's fair to say that obviously things are going to become much worse. Already, reports of up to 10 million people being displaced. I'm going to open up at this stage to questions from members, and would ask Liam and Dominic and Caoimhe certainly to join in terms of their perspective. I'm going to start with Deputy Gannon because he's indicated that he may have to leave for the Dáil Chamber.
Very shortly, I'm speaking next.
Gary,
in fact,
thank you.
Thank you to the contributors. It's sobering and terrifying to hear the presentation. My questions are going to be very quick. In relation to the people who are congregating, the refugees, what's their vaccination status at the moment? Because that many people congregating together, inevitably, that's going to create huge risks also. Is there anything that we can do in terms of, I'm about to make statements on the pre-European Council statements very shortly, is there anything we can push on from that regard? In relation to global food supply, I mean, that's the disaster that's literally just, it's not even around the corner, it's on top of us, we're just not seeing the images yet. What can we possibly do? What can we encourage in both ourselves and from the European Union perspective? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Gannon. I'll hand over to Dominic, perhaps on the food security and on the vaccine.
Deputy Gannon, thanks. And I really appreciate you bringing up the issue of the global food security. As you know, anyway, this is a crisis that has been happening for quite some time. It has been propelled by the COVID pandemic, and I don't need to give you the data, but already 13 million people are struggling severely in terms of acute food insecurity in the Horn of Africa alone, never mind Afghanistan. I think the one thing I think that we can do is, you know, there's talk in Brussels certainly of the doubling of the militarisation budget. We're not hearing about doubling of the humanitarian budget for Ukraine. And the Ukraine appeal alone, the flash appeal that was launched by the UN not that long ago, was for 1.14 billion. It's now simply only 37% funded. And most of the crises when you're talking about food security is those appeals are less than 50% funded. Here's what we can do. Cash and cash assistance is critical. We're going to be using that in Ukraine. Ross has already outlined this, that is going to be critical to get cash and larger amounts of cash than we normally would be using in other contexts in terms of rent and keeping people alive. But I think we've certainly seen the evolution of cash in places like Somalia. It's very easy to distribute, it's very easy to target, particularly in conflict zones. But the bottom line is, it cannot be Ukraine, yes, in terms of donor funding, but as well as and not instead of all the other crises.
Apologies to the contributors, but I really need to run, but I'll be back very shortly. I know listening to the others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Stanton. David.
Sorry, Chairman, can you hear me there? I'm remote here in my office. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having trouble with this technology today. Again, I want to welcome our guests here, and it's, I'm completely lost for words. I think a lot of us are when we see this situation emerging. I have met some people who've come here from Ukraine, and they're worried about their families at home, the trauma they themselves have gone through and are suffering at the moment is intense. So we have our own response here in Ireland with respect to the people that come here and how they're going to be looked after and housed, and GP services is an issue. I think Liam is there online. Maybe Liam would just maybe talk to that. GP services here, school services here, and education. They're issues that I'm concerned about in trying to normalise the lives of people, children in particular, who've come here, and young people. Obviously, I heard what was said recently by with respect to doubling the humanitarian budget, and I think that's crucial. My huge concern is if this escalates any further, and if there's talk of weapons that have never been used before, well, maybe they were used in Syria. If they're used, it changes the whole situation even worse, if that's possible. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, and God forbid, nuclear weapons. So this is like the end of the world. I think you said it was like the apocalypse earlier on, Ross, or maybe Matthew said it, but it certainly is. And the ripple effects onto other countries that we've all been talking about, Chairman, over the last while, in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, Somalia and other places, is going to be extraordinary as well, and we can't forget that either. One other question, we did see in the past resistance in countries where refugees in Europe, where refugees actually were to be accommodated, and even here, but Chairman and I had experience of that in our former roles. Maybe you might comment on that, because I think we have to prepare the people here as well, and in Europe, to welcome refugees, and that itself doesn't become an issue, if you follow what I'm trying to say. Again, the vaccination status is something I think that maybe needs to be looked at as well. I looked at some statistics, and I think that 80% of adults were vaccinated in Ukraine. I think I've seen those somewhere, but I stand to be corrected. They're just some of the points and questions I have, but it's just, words fail me, and I'm sure fail my colleagues as well when we see what's going on there. You know, I've met some people whose women and children who've come here and whose husbands and fathers are away, you know, battling and fighting and at risk and may die, and it's just awful what's going on, and what's happening with children and so on in cities, children being trafficked. Just talk about children being taken into Russia, and other people being taken into camps in Russia. From Mariupol, which is, again, goes beyond, it goes back to what happened in the Second World War, if that's the case. Chairman, there's much else I can say, except I think that we must do all we can to support the people who are going through this horrendous suffering, and to try and to argue for a peaceful resolution at every form, including the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Wilson.
Look, and I'd like to thank Jane and Matthew and Ross for their contributions. I'd like to also join with you, Chairman, in welcoming the Ambassador of Poland to the meeting, and indeed in doing so to commend the Polish people for the tremendous efforts they have made to accommodate those fleeing this horrific war in Ukraine. And I'd also like to pay tribute to other countries like Romania, Moldova and others. We read about it every day and we hear it on the television, but when we have witnesses who are on the ground telling us that there are 3.5 million people who have fled Ukraine to date, that there are 6.5 million displaced within Ukraine, and as Ross has said, that is expected to grow to 8 million in the next week or so. It is indeed an horrific situation. I wanted to ask about the vaccination status, etc., but I think, Jane Ann, you mentioned in your contribution that the World Food Programme gets half of the wheat it distributes in humanitarian crisis from Ukraine. That's a very serious statement that you've made, and you've said that you need to find other sources of supplies, and it's important that, horrific and all as the war in Ukraine is and the humanitarian crisis, that there are still huge humanitarian difficulties in Afghanistan, Syria and Yemen. I'd be interested to know from you, Jinan, or from your colleagues, where do you hope to source this from? As a country, we feel that we are self-sufficient in food, but yet we have our Department of Agriculture and our Minister trying to incentivise farmers to grow wheat here for ourselves. So it is actually devastating to hear that half of the wheat came from Ukraine that you are dependent on to feed people in these other countries. So I would be very interested to see where you intend sourcing that from, to also agree with the calls for the humanitarian budget to be increased, and whatever we can do as a committee to encourage not only our own government but our European partners to do so, we will be very glad to do so. And if you have any advice for us in that regard, we'll be very welcome, and we'd like to hear from you. So that's all for the moment, Chairman.
Thank you. I'll go back to Jane Ann now to distribute the questions and observations of Deputy Stanton and Senator Wilson, and then I will resume with Senator Arda. Jane Ann, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think there's a number of questions there, and I'll come back to some of them if we don't answer them in the first instance. But I'll hand over to Caoimhe, perhaps just particularly with regard to the funding and food security. I think it's clear that I'm not sure we'll have the answer of how WFP will replenish their supplies, but I think it's certain that it's definitely going to become more expensive. So I think the funding and the food security issue are very much interlinked. Caoimhe?
You know, that is precisely it. They are incredibly closely interlinked. In any major crisis such as this, it is not usual that food supply is the problem. It is accessibility. It is the fact that people cannot afford to buy the food that is available. So the immediate impact of the Ukraine crisis, so both Russia and Ukraine are huge grain suppliers and sunflower seed oil as well. It will increase the cost of procuring food for the WFP very, very significantly. So that is an immediate impact in terms of, say, the UN's responses to existing hunger crises. What will happen at a more general level with generalised food price increases, which is also in part caused by fuel increases, is the price of food for the ordinary person will increase. And for people for whom a very large proportion of their income, people on low incomes, huge proportion of their income is spent on food, on transport, so literally bus fares to their place of work or their place of education. And the third piece then is typically the cost of rent if they're in rented accommodation. So if food prices and fuel prices increase, we are going to see huge spikes in poverty amongst people, even people who are not living in conflict-affected countries. For people living in conflict-affected countries, as Dominic has already said, there is a food security crisis across East Africa and in many other countries, which is almost unparalleled. So the UN has said that 274 million people prior to the Ukraine crisis were in immediate need of humanitarian assistance, and that is almost double the figure of 2 years ago. So we're already facing this huge humanitarian crisis across the world. Now, one of the things that we can do, which is most effective, is early action. Many of the crises that we are dealing with are anticipatable. Ukraine is one of the exceptions. Nobody saw it coming. But we know when harvests are due and we know when they're not going to come. A colleague of mine was in Zimbabwe and he came home yesterday and he said driving through central Zimbabwe, the harvest is supposed to happen in April and 80% of the crops are wilted in the field. That is a country that was not even on the radar a couple of months ago. So the level of food insecurity and hunger is huge. So I think our group would fully support a recommendation to the government, not only to protect its entire aid budget, but to increase the aid budget. The government has a commitment to 0.7%, so I think now is a time for the government to look at front-loading that commitment. So in the forthcoming budget, to increase the aid budget by a disproportionately high percentage of the budget. And in the interim, to ensure that the pledges that are being made are not displacing humanitarian funding to other crises, but are additional. And the third point I'd make with respect to ODA is that, unfortunately, in our view, expenditure on support to refugees in host countries such as Ireland can now be technically considered ODA under the DAC rules. This is something we entirely disagree with. It does not align to Ireland's values or our principles. So I think the Irish government should make a point of ensuring that expenditure on support to Ukrainian refugees in Ireland does not come from ODA, and to make that a strong international point. I think furthermore, if I could just introduce another point that has been made by other speakers, something we're incredibly concerned about is protection of vulnerable people who are displaced, particularly people being displaced over borders. What we're seeing, Trócaire works with Caritas Internationalis. Caritas has already supported 250,000 people in Ukraine and in Poland. And again, to recognise the presence of the Ambassador of Poland and the incredible work that the Government of Poland has been doing with civil society in this response. One thing that we're seeing, again, as more and more vulnerable people come to the borders, is that you have people who are incredibly vulnerable to being trafficked. And 1 in 4 people in Europe who are trafficked into forms of modern slavery are children. And unfortunately, in Ireland, we will not be immune to this, but the risk at the border is extremely high. So looking at providing support to typically underfunded services such as the protection services, safeguarding, trafficking services in all of those border countries is incredibly important at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I'll hand over to Liam. Perhaps there was a number of questions there with regards to primarily around the integration of Ukrainian refugees here in Ireland and access to certain services, as well as integration within the communities. Thanks.
Okay, just an answer really to what David was talking about in respect to integration. The response in Ireland currently is phenomenal, really, and it's coming right from the ground. It's also been led, to be fair, from a government side as well. We're looking at a very practical example of it is the pledging database that we have in the Red Cross, and we've received at this stage 21,000 pledges of accommodation, which is astonishing. I mean, we would have thought during the time when there was the Syrian crisis, we received just under 1,000. So this is a huge outpouring of concern and empathy, actually, from Irish people. I've also seen it, I think, with the amounts of money that has been donated in terms of cash, huge volumes of money from people from all walks of life, from the business community, from individuals, groups coming together constantly to organise funding, and that's really welcome. I think in terms of the integration side of it, what we're noticing on the ground is that communities are actually coming together, looking to bring refugees into their community. And that's something we haven't really witnessed at this level before. We've seen it with the community sponsorship programme to some degree, but this is at a different level, where the community wants the refugees in their community, and are already identifying education resources and work resources to enable the refugees settle in the community. At the same time, given the number that have come to date, which I think is somewhere in the region of 9,500, clearly the emergency accommodation and the emergency reception centres are becoming under pressure. And that's why the pledges in particular that we need to be able to deliver on the pledges, particularly the vacant properties that we're following up on at the moment with the Defence Forces and the state agents who are assisting us with that. On top of that, then, there is obviously the shared accommodation, which I know from the time with the Syrian refugees coming here was hugely popular and successful. It was a wonderful way for particularly the younger men to integrate into Irish society. On this occasion, the government have rightly taken a decision that child protection, given the number of women and children that are actually to be housed, that has to be right up front and dealt with all of the shared accommodation. So we're beginning to move on that now in conjunction with the Garda Vetting Bureau, who have committed to reducing the time that they will come back to us with Garda Vetting to 7 days from a much more extensive period. As well as that, I think you've seen obviously at the ports and at the airport, besides the Red Cross being there on a welcoming and transport and the support roles, the use of the hub in Dublin Airport and the new hubs in the city centre, and the other coordination that's happening in Rosslare and Dublin and Cork and Shannon, that's working quite well. And it's good to see the state and ultimately our own sector coming together to deliver on that for the Ukrainian people coming here. Other than that, I think just to say that that our own members are coming back to us, looking to know how they can support, and they are supporting with direct intervention in terms of donations of cash and vouchers mainly to enable people settle in. Finally, it should be said too, the manner in which the Protection Directive has been implemented here in Ireland deserves great credit. It really does, because it means that people are able to come here and know that the system that is here for all of our citizens is open and accessible to them, which will enable settling and will enable integration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do I see Senator Arda with a hand raised?
Thank you very much,
please.
Chair, and I have been listening, so I'll be very brief. I just want to say thank you to all the contributors today, and I've been listening, but I just want to thank the Polish ambassador, because I think Poland really led the way in terms of, you know, opening your doors to Ukrainian refugees, and we watched in the first few days of the war, especially just the amount of people who were welcomed in Poland, and just like the difference between, say, for instance, Poland and our neighbours in the UK, and the different attitude that you took. So I think your country have to be really commended for that. And I like to think we followed suit, obviously from a distance. We're doing all we can. I work with a Polish colleague from Lublin, which is obviously a city, you know, very close to the Ukrainian border. And Polish people living in Ireland are really proud of their home country and all the support you're giving to the Ukrainian people. But obviously all the other contributors today, it's great to hear the Red Cross are putting Garda vetting up at the fore, and that's going to be, you know, it's something I suppose that we've learned from the past, and that we're making sure we don't make mistakes in relation to vulnerable people. But just in relation to the situation in the Ukraine, like we're reading today that over 2,400 children have been taken out of the jurisdiction of the Ukraine and transferred to Russia. It's just like, what is going on? Like, obviously it's an anecdotal news report, but it's terrifying what's happening to vulnerable people, to children. And what can we do from an Irish perspective to do a bit more? It's just, obviously, it's what, you know, what can anyone do? But it's just the whole situation is, and I think we all, you know, have just expressed how angry and how sad and terrified we are for all the vulnerable people living in the Ukraine. But I'll leave it at that, because I think all the contributors raised the question I would have liked to raise. Thank you, Chair. Okay,
thanks, Catherine. And indeed, just for my own part, indeed to follow on from what Catherine has said, maybe to address a couple of issues to Ross and Matthew, just in respect of the situation within Ukraine. And I suppose over the last while here, in terms of this discussion, we have I suppose somewhat meandered from within Ukraine to the neighbourhood, to Ireland and back. But just on the situation in Ukraine, obviously the humanitarian situation is dire. There is need for safe and protected humanitarian corridors. Obviously, that works both ways. It allows people to leave areas that are really adversely affected, but it also, importantly, allows aid in. And maybe just a few moments on the situation within Ukraine and, how the absence of humanitarian corridors are obviously making a bad situation worse. Wondering, for example, when we see on our screens or read reports of the city of Mariupol, I mean, what is the hospital situation like there, if any? What medical teams are on the ground there? Because it seems to me to be bordering on total devastation, with an inability on the part of aid workers to enter and work. Wondering, in respect of the special emphasis that Ros has placed on children and unaccompanied minors. We note, for example, that a figure of more than 1.5 million children have now fled. It seems that many of these are separated. So is there a special programme designed to meet the needs of separated children or minors who've been separated from their parents and families? And is there a form of, urgent attention available to those in the neighbourhood? In respect of the assistance coming from neighbouring countries, and indeed coming from Ireland, and acknowledging what Liam and others have said in respect of the generosity of the Irish people. But we see, again, movement of goods, movement of cash. Obviously, the emphasis has been on the cash donations because, again, we see some potentially, I suppose, issues of a logistical nature in terms of the distribution of the many goods. So if your message to us here today is that, cash donations are obviously the priority, but it seems from reading Ross's report that in terms of human personnel, the situation within Ukraine can get somewhat overwhelmed in the short term. So would there be a role for international personnel to assist in terms of emergency workers, police, fire brigade, civil defence, other either volunteers or workers who might be called upon to assist? Could I ask Ross, and again, it's not something that I saw in his presentation, but it's something that reports have been dealing with, and that is the matter of forced deportation. We have seen people fleeing to the west and to the south, but we see reports in eastern Ukraine of a forced deportation of people being bused, perhaps against their will, to Russia. And I'm wondering, is there any role or is there any engagement in terms of humanitarian aid personnel in that respect on the Russian side? Is there any evidence of any camps or accommodation centres on the Russian side to which humanitarian aid might be required but is not allowed? And maybe again, just briefly to Ross and Matthew, in terms of the adjoining countries, and we have acknowledged the Trojan work of the Polish people and the Polish government by way of leadership in the region. Obviously, the situation in Moldova is critical, having regard to the poor state of infrastructure and maybe not the same level of expertise as in other countries in the region. Now, I note that Ireland has indicated our acceptance of 500 refugees who have departed Ukraine for Moldova, and wondering how that is coordinated through the agencies. And I suppose finally, from my perspective to Cuiva, in respect of the coordination, obviously in a crisis, there is need to ensure that there isn't an overlapping of work, and how is that monitored, or how is that done? I note here in Ireland, for example, not only the coming together of various groups under DOCUS, but also more recently the Irish Emergency Alliance, involving 7 members, including Trócaire, and perhaps you might give us a moment as to how you feel that is a welcome coordination of expertise, experience, in a way that ensures that the monies and the aid can be best put to use, I suppose, notwithstanding the emergency nature of things. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Chairman Flanagan. I'll pass over perhaps to Ross, particularly on some of the questions with regards to the assistance with neighbouring countries and the movements of goods and cash, and also specifically a little bit on any, I suppose, information that you may have, particularly on the Russian side, and the movement of people in that direction. And indeed also to Matthew, I think, with regards to the, I suppose, the humanitarian corridors, or lack thereof, and that impact that is having on places like Mariupol. Ross?
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, on Cathaoirleach, I might just, in terms of responding to what may be happening in the East and from a Russian perspective, frankly, we just don't know. To the best of my understanding, there is little or no appetite nor tolerance for international humanitarian organisations over there. And I would say that we have probably a far greater opportunity in terms of getting information through diplomatic or United Nations channels than we will be through civil society. Civil society is very, very heavily controlled in that part of the world, to the best of my understanding. And so we have little or no visibility. We've been hearing the same things as you're hearing. We're largely relying on media for that information. Possibly, Matthew, from an ICRC perspective, you might have greater visibility and understanding and knowledge of what's going on there. But from the international humanitarian organisations' perspective, we know little about what is going from the eastern side of the country further east. It is just not on our radar. I might just say something a little bit about humanitarian corridors, and I'm referring very specifically to what I would consider to be informal, so they're non-formalised humanitarian corridors. We spent a number of days a couple of weeks ago on border areas in Romania and in Moldova, where just due to the relationships, it's really about relationships, cross-border relationships. To give it maybe an Irish perspective, it's a bit like border county folk here in Ireland crossing the border to work in Fermanagh and Antrim and Derry, and then going home again of an evening. This is going on pre-conflict. I'll give you an example. A large city of about 500,000 people called Șeveníște. It's about 40 kilometres north of Romania. Before the Second World War, it was part of Romania. People there speak as much Romanian as they do Ukrainian. And the officials and the authorities on both sides, both in Șeveníște and on the Romanian side are in touch every day. We met with the authorities in both Sighet and Siret, which are two of the big border crossings in border towns in Romania, and they said that we get phone calls every day. These people over there tell us what they need, we mobilise it and we send in as best we can and we support them that way. So these humanitarian corridors, as they call them, do exist, and they exist because the conflict has not travelled this far west, and long may that continue. So from the perspective of international organisations, international humanitarian organisations working in Ukraine, accessing Ukraine, there is regular and relatively easy access in from Romania, from Slovakia, from Hungary, and through a number of areas in Poland. I travelled in from Poland into the western part of Ukraine last week. I'm travelling back there again later this week, and we see absolutely no issues or problems in that regard in terms of getting backwards and forwards. In the border areas, crossing the border, there are trucks carrying goods constantly in and out of Romania, from Romania into Ukraine and backwards and forwards, the same with Poland. So the borders are relatively open in the areas that are accessible, but it has to be said there is so much uncertainty in terms of what will happen next that this does affect the flow of aid and affect the flow into the friendly neighbouring countries. We just don't know what's going to happen next. And on Comhairle, to answer your question in relation to, are there, if I understood you correctly, are there enough humanitarian workers inside Ukraine supporting the huge flows of people? I think at this moment in time there are plenty of humanitarian agencies accessing western and central Ukraine. The programmes of assistance and support that have been largely done with volunteer groups up to now and local self-help groups are now starting to get significant support from international humanitarian organisations. The government of Ukraine have made it very, very clear that if you're coming to help us, you are welcome. They've waived all registration and other kind of requirements, at least for the current time. So we are working in and accessing in a way that is relatively free right now. But having said that, it's very, very uncertain as to what will happen next week and next month. The collective centres I referred to in my opening statement, where people on the move travelling from east to west are taking respite for some days up to recently, but now more permanently. They are starting to get a lot of attention and a lot of support from international organisations, supporting local authorities and then supporting local self-help groups to make these, to ensure that the local first responders are able to do their work in a more, let's say, responsible way. I mean, right now we have people who are volunteers and are doing their best with very, very little. What we need is a bit of organisation, a bit of coordination, a bit more structure to this, and certainly a lot of sensitisation and awareness around humanitarian principles, around protection of children and women in particular, so that we can make sure that the dignity that these people are being afforded outside of Ukraine when they come to countries like Ireland can be afforded to them inside Ukraine while they're on the move, while they are at their most traumatised and at their most fearful of where they've just come from and where they're going next. And I apologise if I've missed a question or two there. Matthew, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to what I've said.
Yeah. Thanks, Ross. Matthew, yes, would you like to join in there? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ros. Thank you, Comhairle. Yes, coming on to the humanitarian corridors, so particularly a focus for the ICRC within Ukraine, and obviously a lot of focus has been on Mariupol. And I would echo the point about some informal corridors. In that context, people have been able to see some respite in the hostilities and basically make their own convoy and get out. And in fact, last week, our team that had pretty much been taking shelter for days on end, led one of those unofficial convoys, and many of our colleagues left Mariupol. There was a moment for them to do that, and many of them with their families and children decided to do that, and I think many of us would have done that as well. I think in terms of corridors, we've been repeating this message loud and clear that we absolutely welcome any possible opportunity for respite from fighting and a chance for people to get out, but also for aid to get in. But we've not seen enough of that in Mariupol, and that boils down to the fact that there has not been the concrete agreement between the parties to the conflict. And we're often asked, when does the corridor open? What are you doing? But of course, we can't manage that. We can't police that. We can be there as a presence, and we can oversee and facilitate. But ultimately, that concrete agreement needs to be made. And in Mariupol, that's not happened. But also with corridors, there must never be any impression that outside of that corridor or outside of that time, anything goes, because far from it. We absolutely remind everybody that civilian infrastructure are protected at all times. In terms of the hospital situation in Mariupol, it is so difficult now to get information. We know our colleagues were able to provide supplies in the early days of the conflict, but then that access was very limited. We've got medical supplies pre-positioned in various places, such as Dnipro, and we are wanting to get that into Mariupol as soon as we possibly can. But I'm sad to say that that's not happening at the moment. There was a question about separated children, which is absolutely critical, and perhaps something I should have mentioned earlier in my submission, that one of the key things, and this is an area of focus for the Red Cross movement across the world, is when families are separated, and we see all too often that families are separated in a conflict like this. And actually, the statistics we've been thinking about this afternoon in terms of people displaced within the country and outside, what we've seen in conflicts around the world is that people are displaced within a country multiple times. Actually, now we're approaching 4 weeks of this conflict, but that's obviously a fear that people will move to safety. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the west of the country, but we hope that people will not have to flee multiple times. And actually, the psychosocial support that Red Cross staff and volunteers in the neighbouring countries and within Ukraine will be providing is critical, because some of the hidden conflict consequences, the toll on people's mental health is just can be astronomical, and that's something we're very aware of, and we have experts, and we've talked a little bit about Red Cross societies such as the Polish Red Cross Society, such fantastic work that their staff and volunteers are doing, and they will have experts in this regard. And coming on to the experts, I think possibly to go towards the question of goods or cash or sending in workers. I mean, it's very clear for us at the ICRC that we stick strictly to this neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian action. And for us at the ICRC, I mentioned the 600 plus 140 staff. It's crucial for us that it's our staff working with the staff and volunteers of the Ukrainian Red Cross within the country, but it's our staff that do this work because they really do have expertise. As an example, we have weapons experts who've been working in the east of the country for 8 years. For example, working in communities with schools where we've had to help protect schools, sandbags at the windows, bomb shelters on both sides of what was the line of contact in the Donbass. And so we've got more weapons experts going into the country to do that kind of thing. The risks of unexploded ordnance and the risks that poses to the civilian population, I mean, it almost doesn't bear thinking about, but that is what we think about, and that's what our experts will be looking to try and work with communities and local authorities and other humanitarian organisations to try and help people. So certainly for us, if people ask, we're extremely grateful. The generosity that was mentioned from the people of Ireland is just amazing, and we do ask for cash donations so that we can try and find our ways. And it's a complicated sort of mapped system now to get supplies into Ukraine, and where are your suppliers within Ukraine, and how do you get it to different parts of the country when roads come under attack? And then just finally, if I may, just there was a question about forced displacement. It's not something we have any first-hand information about, but it's clear that people, when they leave, must be able to leave voluntarily. And I think, as colleagues mentioned earlier, it's very important that focus is paid to the vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the injured, people with disabilities who will not easily be able to move. And just a note on the Russian side, I mentioned that we've been working in Ukraine for 8 years on both sides of the line of contact, and I know from our updates that our partners at the Russian Red Cross have been working tirelessly, because people have been displaced in that direction. Something like 94 points of distribution for humanitarian aid, and many children having to be moved into different communities and perhaps to relatives there. So as well as the fantastic work of our Red Cross colleagues on the west side of Ukraine, we also pay tribute to our colleagues in Russia too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'll hand over to Caoimhe now with just regard to the kind of coordination element, particularly both on the ground and indeed within the IEA as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe. So thank you firstly for the question about the Irish Emergency Alliance, which is a relatively young organisation, but it's one which is based on a model that exists in many other countries and has done extremely effectively for many years. And the principle it's based on is that in any humanitarian emergency, you need to act quickly to coordinate all of the many disparate actors who are working to support the people affected by the crisis, and that is both within the country affected but also outside. So the Irish Emergency Alliance is made up of 7 Irish humanitarian and development NGOs, including Trócaire, and we are responding collectively both to fundraise but also to support the coordination and sharing of information around our operations in and around Ukraine. So this has already proved extremely useful and extremely fruitful. So we have a 3-week-long coordinated fundraising campaign which reduces the costs to each individual agency, for example, of buying media time, and gives the public one port of call. Or one additional port of call. So it's effective in terms of giving the public a simpler set of choices. But also what we're able to identify as 7 agencies working locally is that we have better scale and impact to coordinated action. So I mentioned earlier that Trócaire through Caritas has already reached 250,000 people in Ukraine and Poland. And then adding the other 6 agencies and their scale and reach, and the way that we're able to coordinate, share information, distribute analysis amongst ourselves, means that impact is much, much stronger across the 7 agencies. So in other countries where these mechanisms have existed for a longer time period than here in Ireland, typically the agencies get support from the government in terms of, for example, match funding. So in the UK, in the Netherlands, Japan, Switzerland, many other countries, what will often happen is that the government will match funding possibly up to a certain level and provide that to the coordinated alliance model, and that works very effectively. Coordination within the country is also extremely important, and I think Ross may have touched on it a little earlier, but what we're seeing in Ukraine is a situation which is not always parallel to other situations we're in that the institutions in Ukraine work. It is a country with well-established governance, administrative institutions, and a very strong and active civil society. So it's no accident that, as Ross has mentioned, you have over 100 collective centres established very quickly, because many of those are based on units that already existed. Caritas Ukraine has 70 centres in operation any day of the week prior to the crisis across the entire country. So there is an opportunity to work with and to strengthen the local civil society and civil authorities systems. The last thing that we need to do is to undermine it by imposing external models, because that is not what is needed. I think exactly as Ross and as Matthew have said, that there is a system there that we need to lean into and support, and that is in terms of funding. So the cash for what people locally know is needed, the technical expertise which they may be missing, but there are high levels of skills and capacity locally. One thing that I think is important to note is that over the past month, as inevitably happens in any humanitarian response, local people volunteer. They put their own lives on hold and they volunteer to respond. But a volunteer-led response can only last so long. All of those people need to somehow create their own livelihoods again. So what we need to do is to enable in a solid manner, exactly as Ross has said, those local organisations to expand, to have more staff employed, to have the skills and technical expertise that they need to mount a long-term response. This response, unfortunately, is going to last a long time, and it's the local institutions that will be there long, long after this has disappeared from the media headlines. So in terms of local coordination, what we know is coordination is working very well. For example, the CASH working group, which is an essential part of the humanitarian system, is working very well with government, identifying what the obstacles are and moving them on. Integrating the CASH with the social protection system is very important. Again, administrative systems exist, we need to support and build on them. So that's just a note about local coordination. The last thing I'll say, maybe just on the corridors, because this is absolutely crucial. What we're experiencing is that certain areas of the country, you have reasonably good mobility, but in areas protected by conflict, humanitarian convoys are being shelled. So we're having to shift from using something that might be identifiable as a humanitarian convoy to smaller vehicles that are operating in a more informal way. So that immediately reduces the volume of goods that you can move from one place to another. So it just reinforces and underscores the importance of diplomacy, the importance of putting pressure for a negotiated ceasefire. And I just want to add in one thing that hasn't come up, which is the almost complete absence, from what we know, of women's voices in any negotiations that are happening. Ireland has an incredibly strong record on ensuring that women are involved in an equal, meaningful and participative way in peace negotiations. If women are not at the table, then the whole community will regret that for many, many years down the line. So something that the Irish government could do in terms of its international diplomacy, its work at the UN Security Council, is to ensure that the advocacy, the diplomacy includes ensuring the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in the negotiations around a lasting peace.
Thank you. Deputy Gannon had indicated he wished to come back.
Yeah, thanks to the contributors. I have a number of questions actually, but I suppose time is short and you've answered most of them. In terms of the confluence of crises that's happening at the minute, so huge levels of displacement, war, a global pandemic, food shortages, are we even conscious of what's upon us at the minute, both at a state level, a European level? I mean, you work in humanitarian organisations, you must be seeing this. Should we be terrified? What's the response?
I'll hand over to Dominic, I think, for that one. Impart your wisdom, I think.
I mean, the truth is, I think that we've seen an erosion of news media coverage on many of the crisis countries. Afghanistan isn't on the agenda anymore. And it was top of the news while there was an evacuation, and it was top of the news everywhere. And it's not talked about. And there are simple solutions. I think this is what we need to talk about. What do we need to do? You know, the $7 billion that's still frozen, largely by the US federal in terms of Afghan's reserves, as well as the $2 billion that's frozen by European banks, including Germany, needs to be released. And there's a campaign to try and get that money moved, and moved rapidly back in to where it should be. Whether it's set up through a trust fund, if it's not going directly into the authorities. But I think the thing is, I think with every crisis is unique. It's unique in terms of its complexity. It's unique in terms of its scale. But often they house exactly similar characteristics. And we only need to look back 11 years to Syria. And Ukraine is in danger of becoming the next Syria. And I think if we do look back and we say, what would we have done differently? We would have ramped up diplomacy much, much more in the early days. There was much more talk about politicisation and militarisation and ending the war. And I do think Ireland is already playing a fairly unique role. Jeremy Byrne, the Irish ambassador, has been a really, really strong, compelling voice, working within a structure that we know is hampered, and but has managed to reach out to the member states to push beyond kind of the confines of the Security Council. And I think that's critically important. I think there is an opportunity. I mean, I think the last time I think we saw the scale of response in relation to this was either Haiti or the tsunami, because people relate. And there is extraordinary generosity from the public, from the neighbouring countries, Poland, and we have to capitalise on that. There is extraordinary solidarity with Ukrainian flags being flown everywhere across this country. So I think that has to be matched very, very clearly. Through the EU, I do not think that the EU is taking a strong enough stance in relation to negotiations and being at the table strongly enough. It has been left to the US. It is becoming more partisan. But back to your point again, I do think there are some initiatives that are happening. I think that we're now seeing that the appetite for people to listen to what's actually happening on the ground has never diminished. And human response and empathy for what people are witnessing has not diminished. But the political will to end these seems to be the real challenge. And I think, as I say, Ireland, I can't criticise Simon Coveney, Mr. Coveney was in here, and the 4 or 5 steps that he laid out are exactly the ones that Ireland has a roadmap. We just need to push it, and I think really focus on Brussels.
Thanks, Owen.
Okay, thank you. So, Jane Ann, before bringing matters to a conclusion, I don't see any other questions from members watching online, or with us online. So what I propose to do, Jane Ann, is maybe a final word to yourself and Liam and Dominic and Caoimhe and Ross and Matthew in terms of your priority message to us as parliamentarians, as politicians. And this committee tomorrow will have an opportunity, which has been quite kindly arranged by Ambassador to Poland. We will be engaging directly with our colleagues in the Polish Foreign Affairs Committee. On Friday, I will have an opportunity of engaging with fellow chairs across the EU, and again, primarily organised by Poland, where again we'll have an opportunity for parliamentarians to exchange views. So maybe you all would leave us with your priority messaging, and again on behalf of members and on my own behalf, I thank you for taking time to be with us today on what is a shocking and horrific crisis within Europe. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Chairman. And I suppose before I hand over to my colleagues, I think I would like to, I suppose, end just with reiterating what Caoimhe had mentioned earlier, because I know it's not just unique to Concern, Troca, or indeed the Red Cross, but it's universal for all of our members in DOCAS. And it is this issue around funding. It is clear that there is a need for humanitarian assistance and funding in Ukraine right now, and for that response as well for Ukrainian refugees and those displaced within the country. But that cannot come at the expense of other humanitarian crises around the world. And we know and we anticipate that responding to those crises is going to become more expensive. And I suppose that we are asking now, I suppose in light of Ukraine, where we can see both not only the need for humanitarian assistance, but the impact that it can have on individuals on the ground. We know and we see ourselves as organisations working on the ground in Afghanistan, in Syria, in other conflict areas, the impact of that aid. And we would ask that the government continue to work on the roadmap towards a 0.7% and ensure that additional support that is provided to the Ukraine is just that, additional to other commitments to humanitarian funding for other crises around the world. And with that, I'll hand over to Liam, perhaps.
Okay, I have a very simple message really, and that is the importance of the coordination of government and civil society in responding to the refugees who are coming here. We saw that, I think, with the Syrian situation and the refugees coming here. There was a task force set up, and I think that type of coordination is critical in terms of making sure that the refugees who come here are welcomed, they're integrated and they're supported. And they're given an opportunity to add to Irish society, which is what I think they will do. And the other is the importance of international humanitarian law, and that would continually be a strong message from government into the various structures.
Thank you.
Dominic?
Chairman, briefly, I suppose I'm restating, what I have said, but I guess really Ireland does need to try and get the EU and other larger institutions to redouble diplomacy efforts. And I think in particular what we've heard is Humanitarian Corridors is probably the lower form. It is pushing for a ceasefire, because we cannot be satisfied with allowing people to flee for assistance while many more will be waiting inside for aid to go in. And Maripol is a failure. It is a failure to intervene. So that has to be pushed at. Not easy, but that has to be pushed at on all levels. Push for donor funding to be proportionate, particularly in relation to the escalating humanitarian needs. I think we have to watch very closely the neighbouring countries. I think Ross said that. This situation is changing very rapidly, and we cannot say Poland has done a really good job, well done Poland, but actually this crisis is unfolding. And I think this committee, I welcome the fact that you've asked for this meeting today, and I think you should repeat these on a regular basis, because it is changing fast. And I do appreciate the comments and the recognition that Ukraine is not a standalone crisis. It is potentially now creating a new hunger pandemic, and we are a nation that has a very strong reputation in relation to and a priority of ending conflict and hunger. And there's our opportunity, I think, to bring some of that to the policy influence. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I can only underscore a couple of the points made by my colleagues. So one is around the funding, and let me add to Jane Ann's points around volume of funding by just talking about the nature of funding. Funding is hugely valuable where it is coordinated, flexible and prioritises local actors. Again, just to underscore the point that this is a long-term crisis, we need to make sure that funding supports local actors in Ukraine and in the neighbouring environments. We need to make sure that it supports coordinated mechanisms, such as the Irish Emergency Alliance, but other coordinated mechanisms. We need to make sure that it is flexible. To the point that my colleague just made, this is a rapidly changing environment. If funding is tied up in rules, which means that we cannot move it to where it's needed most, when it's needed most, then it becomes a burden. So funding needs to be flexible, coordinated and local. And I think the final point I'd make is that we need to treat this as a gendered crisis. No crisis is not gendered. Women and children are in the forefront, disproportionately suffering from this crisis. So we need to start speaking of it in terms of a gendered crisis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jane Ann. Would Ross and Matthew like a final word?
Ross, would you like to go ahead?
Sorry, yes, I might just go ahead. Thank you very much to all of you and all of the contributions. And Caoimhe, particularly, I was about to mention the extent that the crisis is so dynamic, uncertain and fast moving, and that we need to be agile and flexible in terms of funding and how we work. So thank you for mentioning that. But from my own perspective, the message I would like to leave with you on Oireachtas and the other esteemed members here today is that the focus so far, really in terms of Europe and the international community, has been on those who have crossed borders. And we now need to really double down on how we support those people inside Ukraine on the move to ensure that the dignity we've afforded to people who have left the country and arrived in countries like Ireland can be afforded to those who remain inside Ukraine and who are on the move and are living in a far more uncertain environment than those who have been fortunate enough to date to get out. And so that would be my message. It's about inside Ukraine and those people on the move. For every person who's left the country, there are currently 3 on the move, and that will be 4 on the move by the end of this month. And that is a staggering number of people by any count.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Matthew, would you like to say a word?
Yes, thank you. I think I would just obviously encourage Ireland to continue playing the key role as a strong supporter and promoter of international humanitarian law in whichever fora you're working, you're talking with your contacts. That's a critical role because that will potentially benefit the people caught up in the conflict. And again, just, I mean, there was a comment there about the rules. I think just to repeat the request for you to support our request to the EU for humanitarian exemptions in relation to sanctions, because it's such a complicated and difficult response that is requiring an agile turnaround, but it potentially could be made harder by the impacts of some of the decisions. So support on that front would be potentially invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much, Corla, for your time today.
Okay, thank you, Jane and colleagues. And I also wish to acknowledge the fact that you put your opening statements in writing, which you know, obviously makes really grim reading. Members will have an opportunity of sharing that and indeed sharing our experience of the last couple of hours with members of both houses. Over the next day or so. I mean, it seems to me that there are three alternatives in terms of what might happen next. Firstly, a protracted war. Secondly, a peace deal. And thirdly, a regime change in Russia. Of those three, it seems to me that the most likely is a protracted war. And in that regard, let me acknowledge the great work that you and all of your colleagues are doing from a humanitarian point of view. And I trust, having heard your submissions today, we would like maybe to have a further opportunity of direct engagement should matters not lead to a peace deal earlier than we all would wish. And like. So thank you for being with us and thank you for dealing with the observations and questions of our members. I'm going to say to members, hold on, we have some private business to get through and we will allow our guests and witnesses to leave. And thank you.